There are moments in a person's life that don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with warning sirens or flashing lights. They don't give you time to brace, to prepare, to decide who you want to be when they finally come. They simply happen, quiet and sudden and irreversible. And by the time you understand what you're standing in the middle of, the moment has already defined you. Nora Callahan had lived 26 years without a single moment that mattered to anyone but herself. She had grown up in a narrow house on the edge of a narrow street in a part of the city that people drove through quickly with their windows up. She had watched her mother work herself into exhaustion, keeping the lights on, the heat running, the refrigerator just barely stocked. She had learned early what it meant to need things you couldn't ask for, to want a life that wasn't designed for people like you, to swallow your hunger so quietly that eventually even you forgot it was there. Her mother had died 14 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, discovered too late and fought too hard with money they didn't have. The hospital bills had arrived in stacks while Nora was still picking out a casket. She had signed everything without reading the fine print because grief doesn't leave room for fine print. And by the time she understood what she owed, the number had a shape to it that felt less like debt and more like a sentence. $41,000. She had been paying it back in increments so small they were almost insulting. $60 here, $80 there, while working double shifts at Callaway's, one of those restaurants that existed in a part of the city so far removed from where Nora had grown up that she sometimes felt like a guest in someone else's life just by walking through the staff entrance. Callaway's was the kind of place where the lighting was always amber and intentional, where the wine list was longer than most short stories, where the tables were spaced far enough apart to suggest that the conversations happening at them were worth protecting. The clientele were people of consequence. Politicians, developers, corporate architects of things, ordinary people never saw coming. They ate slowly and tipped inconsistently and rarely looked at the faces of the people who served them. Nora had learned not to need them to. She had been working at Callaway's for 3 years, long enough to know which regulars were harmless and which ones watched her a half second too long enough to know which tables tipped well, regardless of service, and which ones required performance, long enough to become invisible in the precise way that made her good at her job, present enough to anticipate, absent enough not to intrude. She wore her dark hair pulled back every shift, a habit born from practicality that had calcified into reflex. She moved through the floor with a kind of quiet efficiency that her manager Petra had once described in the closest thing Petra ever offered to a compliment as unobtrusive. Now, Nora had gone home that night and looked the word up, not because she didn't know it, but because she wanted to sit with it for a moment, with what it said about the life she had built for herself. Unobtrusive, invisible by design, present without pressure, existing in the margins of other people's important evenings. She had told herself that was fine. She had told herself that fine was enough. On the night of November 14th, Callaway's was running at full capacity. The reservation book had been solid since 6 in the evening. A Thursday, which was unusual, a sign that something in the city's social calendar had aligned to pull people out midweek. The kitchen was running hot, the bar was loud. Petra was moving through the floor with the tightly wound energy of someone managing too many variables at once, and the staff had all quietly calibrated themselves to her frequency, the way they always did on nights like this. Simone had whispered to Nora around 7 o'clock. While they were both resetting a table near the window, full moon energy, I'm telling you, somebody's going to cry in the bathroom before 9. Nora had smiled without looking up from the silverware she was straightening. Might be me, she'd said. Simone had laughed, the easy laugh of someone whose wounds were not currently open, and moved on to her next table. Nora had moved on to hers. At 7:43, Gerald Murch arrived. She didn't know his name then. She would learn it later in stages, the way you learn the names of things that have already hurt you. What she knew in that first moment was the energy of him, the way he pushed through the front entrance with his body slightly ahead of his manners, the way he spoke to the host with the casual authority of someone who had never genuinely worried about a reservation, the way his eyes moved across the room not to appreciate it but to assess it, to locate his position within it. He was thick in the way of men who had once been athletic and had since replaced discipline with entitlement. His face was red around the edges, not embarrassment, not heat, but the particular flush of a man who had already had 2 drinks somewhere else before deciding he needed a third somewhere nicer. His suit was expensive and slightly wrong, the way expensive things look on people who buy them to be seen rather than to belong. He was seated at table 9. Table 9 was in Nora's section. She noticed this the way she noticed most things at work, without drama, without judgment, with only the quiet recalibration of expectation that her job required. She gave him 4 minutes to settle before she approached. She brought water. She introduced the special in the clear, measured tone that Petra had once said was appropriately informative without being excessive. She handed him the wine list. Gerald Murch did not look at her face once during this exchange. He ordered a whiskey. Neat, with the specificity of a man who had an opinion about whiskey and an audience for it. Even when the audience was a single waitress, he would not remember the next morning. Nora brought the whiskey. He ordered another before he'd finished the first. She noticed, she filed it, she moved on. At 8:15, table 7 was sat. Table 7 was not in Nora's section. It was in the center of the floor, one of the restaurant's better tables, wide enough for 4, set in a pool of amber light that made everything at it look cinematic. Petra had taken the reservation personally, which meant it was significant, which meant whoever was coming to table 7 was the kind of guest whose comfort was not left to chance. Nora was crossing toward the service station when she saw them walk in. She noticed the boy first. He was small for what she guessed was 9 or 10 years old, with dark hair cut neatly and eyes that moved around the room with the careful watchfulness of a child who had learned young that environments could shift without warning. He wore a collared shirt, deep navy pressed, and he walked with his hands at his sides rather than in his pockets, which gave him an oddly formal quality, the quality of a child performing composure. Rather than feeling it, he was holding a book, not pressed against his chest in the self-conscious way of children who know they're being watched, but held loosely at his side, spine outward, with the relaxed ownership of someone for whom the book was simply always present, the way other children carried toys. The title was obscured by his fingers, but the cover was dark green with gold lettering, and even from a distance, Nora had the impression of something old and chosen. She might have moved on, would have moved on, except for the man walking beside him. The man who walked beside Eli Voss did not enter a room the way other people entered rooms. He didn't have to announce himself. He didn't move with theatrical slowness or sweep his gaze across the space in the deliberate way of men who want to be noticed. He simply walked in, controlled, unhurried, upright in a way that spoke less of posture and more of absolute certainty about the weight he occupied in the world. And the room responded to him the way a compass responds to north. Not dramatically, not all at once. But Nora watched it happen in the way she sometimes watched things, without meaning to, with the peripheral attention of someone who had learned to read environments early. A man near the bar stopped his conversation mid-sentence, glanced over, looked away too quickly. A woman at table 3 straightened almost imperceptibly in her chair. The sommelier, who had been moving toward a table in the far corner, adjusted his route. Not fleeing exactly, but redirected, the way water moves around something too solid to go through. The man himself seemed to register none of this, or seemed to register all of it without acknowledging any of it, which Nora would later understand were very different things. He was tall, not aggressively so, but in a way that added to his sense of density, of mass, of the impression that he took up exactly the space he intended to take up and not a centimeter more. He wore a charcoal suit of the kind that had clearly been made for his specific body, the kind of garment that never needed adjusting. His hair was dark and shot through with early gray at the temples, cut with the precision of a man whose attention to detail extended to everything, including himself. His face was not handsome in the way of men who know they're handsome, but arresting in the way of faces that have endured things and been restructured by them. A jaw that carried tension even at rest, eyes that were very dark and very still. He placed one hand briefly on the boy's shoulder as they were guided to the table. It was a small gesture, 4 seconds, maybe 5. His hand on the child's shoulder, guiding him without pressure, protective without possession. And in those 4 or 5 seconds, Nora saw something move across the man's face that contradicted everything else about him. Something soft, something guarded, something that looked like love in the particular shape that grief had bent it into. She looked away. She had a job to do. Petra materialized at Nora's elbow approximately 30 seconds later, which told Nora that Petra had been watching the entrance. Table 7, Petra said, in the tone she used when she was delivering instructions that were not actually instructions, but orders dressed in a more palatable grammar. Damien Voss and his son, private, efficient. You will not hover. You will not make conversation beyond what is necessary. You will not ask the child if he wants to hear the specials, because he is 9 years old and does not care about the specials. You will bring what they order when they order it, and you will otherwise be invisible. Nora looked at her. That's not my table. It is tonight, Petra said, and then she walked away, and the matter was settled in the way that all matters were settled when Petra walked away from them. Nora stood for a moment, with the weight of it, Damien Voss. She didn't know the name. She knew the shape of it, the way Petra had said it, not with excitement or reverence, but with a very specific kind of careful neutrality that was its own form of fear. She had heard names said like that before, in this city, in this restaurant. Names that came with a radius of quiet around them, names that other names moved away from. She straightened the pen in her apron pocket and walked to table 7. The boy ordered lemonade and then looked up at her with the solemn attention of a child who had been taught to make eye contact and said, "Could I also have a small plate of bread? The warm kind, if you have it." His voice was careful, polite, a child choosing his words, the way adults choose them, which told Nora something about the environment he navigated daily. "Of course," she said. Damien Voss ordered sparkling water and the branzino without consulting the menu. He had clearly been here before, or had done the research in advance, or simply operated in a way that left no room for indecision. He did not look at her when he ordered. Not rudely, not dismissively, but with the natural precision of a man who directed his attention exactly where it needed to be, and she was not in that moment where it needed to be. She brought the bread first. The boy, Eli, she would come to know, received it with a quiet thank you that was more sincere than half the acknowledgments she received from adults in this restaurant on any given evening. He opened his book while his father looked at something on his phone with the contained, deliberate attention of a man who receives information that other people don't and processes it without expression. Nora moved away. She checked table 12. She brought a second round to table 4. She refilled the water at table 11. She was carrying a tray back toward the service station at 8:51 when she heard the sound. Not a crash, not a shout. Something quieter than both of those things, and more wrong for it. A chair scraping, a glass shifting, and then a voice, Gerald Murch's voice, thickened by whiskey and shaped by something Nora recognized instinctively. The particular timbre of a man who has decided that the space he is in belongs to him. Hey, kid. Nora stopped. She was 6 feet from the service station, facing away from table 9. She turned the way you turn toward sounds that your body recognizes before your mind does. Gerald Murch had pushed his chair back and angled his considerable weight toward table 7. He was holding his whiskey glass loosely, the way drunk men hold things, confident they won't drop it, wrong in ways they don't yet know. His face was deeply flushed now. His tie had been loosened at some point in the past hour, and there was a quality to his expression that Nora had seen before on other faces in other settings. The look of a man who has been drinking towards something, who has located a target, who has found the specific variety of courage that alcohol manufactures from the cheapest materials. Eli Voss had looked up from his book. He hadn't moved, he hadn't flinched, but his hands, Nora could see from across the floor, had closed more tightly around the spine of it, and the green book, the gold lettering, the thing he carried everywhere, and his face had gone very still in a way that was not calm, but the performance of calm, and Nora knew that performance. She had worn it herself, in too many rooms for too many years. "What are you reading, kid? Something important? You too good to look at people." The entire floor had gone a half-degree quieter. Damien Voss had not yet looked up from his phone, or had. not yet appeared to look up from his phone, which Nora was already beginning to understand was not the same thing. Gerald Murch leaned further, elbows going to his knees, the slow animal lean of a man, making himself large in the direction of something smaller. I'm talking to you. Where's your manners? Your daddy teach you to ignore people? He laughed at his own provocation, a short, wet sound. And that was the moment, not dramatic, not announced, just the moment. Nora Callahan set her tray on the nearest flat surface, the corner of the service counter steady, no noise, and she walked to table 9. She did not run. She did not rush. She walked with the unhurried purposefulness of someone who has decided something and is no longer negotiating with herself about it. And she stepped directly into the sightline between Gerald Murch and Eli Voss. And she said, in a voice that was clear and level and not loud, "Sir, can I get you something?" Murch looked up at her, blinked. The interruption had not registered as an interruption yet. It registered as an obstacle, which to a man like Gerald Murch, in this particular state, was almost the same thing. "I'm having a conversation," he said. "Of course," Nora said. "I can see that. But I noticed your glass is getting low, and the kitchen is about to close out the last of the Blanton's reserve. I wanted to make sure you had the chance to order before it was gone." It was a lie so fluent it arrived before she'd consciously constructed it. There was no Blanton's reserve. The kitchen had no relationship with the whiskey supply. But the sentence had been built from what she knew of men like Gerald Murch. Their vanity, their appetite for scarcity, their susceptibility to the suggestion that something exclusive was about to be unavailable to them. He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze, not aggressively, not submissively, with the flat, steady patience of a woman who had been holding men's gazes in exactly this way, unreadable, unafraid, unmoving, for more years than she should have had to. "Fine," he said finally. He settled back into his chair. "Yeah, bring it." "Of course," she said. "I'll be right back." She turned away from him, walked back toward the service station. As she passed table 7, she did not look at the man in the charcoal suit, but she felt him. Not the way you feel a stare, hot and deliberate. The way you feel attention from someone who gives it sparingly and has just decided, without announcement, without theater, to give it to you. She felt it, the way you feel a change in air pressure, the way you feel a room shift its center. She kept walking. She reached the service station. She set her hands flat on the cool metal counter and breathed once slowly, and then she picked up a glass and went to find something she could convincingly pour into it. Simone appeared at her shoulder 3 seconds later. "Nora, I know. That was Gerald Murch. I know. He's on the city zoning board. He has dinner with the deputy mayor twice a month. Petra is going to—" "I know," Nora said again quietly. And there was something in the way she said it the third time that made Simone stop. Not upset, not reckless, just settled, in the way of someone who has done the math and accepted the result. "Was it worth it?" Simone asked. Nora thought about the boy's hands on the spine of his green book, the stillness in his face, the particular shape of composure that children wear when they have learned they must. "Yes," she said. She didn't know yet that Damien Voss had watched the entire thing. She didn't know yet that he had set his phone down on the table, face down, for the first time since they'd arrived. She didn't know yet that he had watched her walk to that table and hold that man's gaze and redirect him with nothing but a sentence and a stillness, watched her protect his son with so little fanfare that the rest of the restaurant had barely registered it, and that something in him, in the deep and heavily defended interior of him, had moved. She didn't know any of that yet. She was too busy pouring whiskey into a glass for a man who didn't deserve it, keeping her hands steady, keeping her face composed, doing what she had always done, getting through the night, making it to the other side. Petra found her at 9:23. The expression on Petra's face was one Nora had seen before. The expression of a woman who has received information she didn't ask for and is now required to transmit it, and is unhappy about what the transmission will reveal about her own position in the hierarchy of things. "Mr. Murch has asked to speak to the manager," Petra said. "I assumed he would," Nora said. "He says you were condescending, that you interrupted a private conversation and fabricated a promotion to redirect his attention." I brought him whiskey, Nora said. He drank it. Petra looked at her for a moment with something that might have been the very early stage of admiration if it had been given more room to develop. You understand what Gerald Murch can do to this restaurant. I understand what he was doing to that child, Nora said. Another look, longer this time. Nora. Petra. The silence between them held several sentences that neither of them said. Then Petra straightened, reset herself to the carefully maintained frequency of professional neutrality. I'll handle Murch. You'll finish your shift. We'll discuss the rest tomorrow. Nora nodded. Thank you. Petra began to walk away. She stopped after 3 steps without turning. The branzino at table 7, she said in a voice stripped of all inflection. It was cooked correctly, wasn't it? It wasn't a question about the fish. Yes, Nora said, it was. Petra walked away. Nora exhaled. She turned back toward the floor, toward the amber light and the careful conversations and the long evening still unwinding around her. And she saw Eli Voss watching her from across the room. He had his book open in his hands, but his eyes were on her, and in them was an expression she recognized instantly and felt somewhere behind her sternum. It was the expression of a child who had been seen. Not noticed, not observed, seen. The difference being the direction of intention, the difference being that being noticed meant someone had looked at you, and being seen meant someone had looked for you, had found you in the crowd and recognized what you were carrying, and acknowledged it without demanding you explain it. She held his gaze for just a moment, then she smiled, small, unhurried, the smile of one person to another in a room full of people who weren't looking. And she turned back to her tables. She didn't see Damien Voss lower his eyes from her face. She didn't see him pick up his phone again and type a single line of text and send it. She didn't see Kyle Renner seated 2 tables away in the direction. She'd never thought to look, acknowledge the message with the smallest tilt of his head. She didn't know that by the time she clocked out that night, someone was already learning her name. Not to threaten it, just to know it. The way you learn the names of things that have surprised you, things you didn't know to look for. Things that turn out to matter in ways you won't understand until much later, when you're standing in the middle of a life that no longer resembles the one you thought you were living. That was the night of November 14th. That was the night everything changed. Neither of them knew it yet, but some things don't need to be known to be true. Some doors open before you reach for them. Some moments choose you long before you choose them back. Nora Callahan went home that night on the last bus, as she always did, and she sat by the window and watched the city slide past in its neon and its quiet. And she thought about a boy with a green book and a face that had learned composure too early. She thought about his hands. She thought about how small they had been, holding something so tightly against a world that had briefly turned in his direction with its full careless weight. And she thought, I would do it again. She would. She had no idea what that decision had already set in motion. If this story has already pulled you somewhere quiet and still, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Stay with it. There are different kinds of silence. There is the silence of empty rooms, which is just absence dressed up as atmosphere. There is the silence of sleeping cities, which is only noise taking a breath before it begins again. There is the silence of grief, which is not silence at all, but a sound so interior and so constant that the world outside it starts to seem like the quiet one. And then there is the silence that follows a decision, the kind that settles over your life in the hours and days after you've done something you cannot undo, something that was right in the way that right things sometimes are. Cleanly, without negotiation, without the comfort of ambiguity. And now you must simply live inside the consequences of your rightness and see what shape they take. Nora Callahan knew that silence well. She had been living inside it since the morning of November 15th, when she woke up in her small apartment on Deering Street, the one with the radiator that knocked and the window that faced a brick wall, and the kitchen that was barely large enough to turn around in, and lay in bed for 4 minutes longer than she usually allowed herself, looking at the water stain on the ceiling that she had long ago stopped seeing, letting herself feel the particular weight of a night that had not yet finished with her. She had protected a child. She had interrupted a powerful and politically connected drunk at one of the city's most reputation-conscious restaurants. And she had done it without permission, without strategy, without anything except the instinct of a woman who had spent a childhood recognizing the sound of vulnerability being circled and had never quite learned to walk away from it. The question now was what it would cost her. She arrived at Callaway's at 10 that morning for what Petra had referred to in the text message she'd sent at 7:45 a.m. as a conversation about last night. The phrasing was careful in the way that Petra's phrasing was always careful, stripped of warmth, stripped of drama, stripped of any word that could later be characterized as either supportive or punitive. Just a conversation about last night. Nora had read it on her phone while standing in her kitchen in yesterday's socks, and she had made coffee before she replied because she had learned from years of working for Petra that the appearance of composure was almost as useful as the thing itself. "I'll be there at 10, she had written back. "Good," Petra had replied, one word which told Nora nothing and everything. The restaurant in the morning was a different creature than the restaurant at night. Without the amber light and the careful arrangements and the human performances that filled it after 6, it was just a room. A large, still vaguely institutional room, with chairs upended on tables and the smell of cleaning solution laid over the deeper smell of last night's kitchen. Nora moved through it with the ease of someone who had crossed it 1,000 times in every configuration and found Petra in her office at the end of the service corridor, behind a desk organized with the obsessive precision of a woman who controlled her environment because she could not always control the things inside it. Petra looked at her when she came in, did not gesture to the chair, did not offer coffee, just looked at her in the particular way Petra had of making eye contact feel like a diagnostic procedure. "Gerald Murch," she said. "Yes," Nora said. "He called this morning." Nora waited. Petra picked up a pen, set it down. A micro gesture of feeling she would never permit herself to voice. "He is not pursuing a formal complaint." The air in the room did something subtle. "He said," Petra continued, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone reading from a document they didn't write, "that on reflection, he may have had more to drink than it was advisable before arriving, and that his behavior toward the other table was, and I'm using his exact word, unregrettable." Nora said nothing. "He also left a tip," Petra said. "On his way out last night, after you'd already gone to the service station." She paused. It was significant. There was a long beat of silence. "Petra," Nora said, "why did he change his mind?" Petra's expression did not shift, but her eyes did something. A small interior movement, the kind that happens when someone knows an answer they have decided not to give. "I imagine," she said slowly, "that he reconsidered the wisdom of escalating something in a room where certain other guests were present." Nora thought about that sentence. Turned it over again. "I see," she said. "Your shift begins at 5, Petra said. "You're on the main floor. Don't be late." And that was that. Nora walked back through the empty restaurant, through the upended chairs and the morning light falling pale and flat through the high windows, and she thought about what it meant that Gerald Murch, with his political connections and his city contracts and his casual weaponized entitlement, had made a phone call at 7 in the morning to remove his own complaint. She thought about the man in the charcoal suit, the one who had set his phone down face down for the first time. She stepped out onto the sidewalk into the thin November air, and she told herself quite firmly that she was not going to think about Damien Voss. She thought about him the entire walk home. She didn't see him again for 6 days. Those 6 days had their own texture, their own specific quality of waiting that she refused to name as waiting because she was not waiting for anything. She was working. She was moving through her tables and her trays and her double shifts with the same quiet efficiency she always had, the same unobtrusive competence, the same careful invisibility, except that it wasn't quite the same, because something had changed in the quality of how the restaurant held her. Subtle things, the kind you couldn't point to directly. The way Petra adjusted her section twice that week without explanation, giving her the better tables, not the most prestigious, but the most consistent, the ones that tipped well and asked nothing unreasonable. The way Simone stopped warning her about things and started simply watching her with the expression of someone waiting to see what would happen next. The way certain members of the staff, who had previously moved around her with comfortable indifference now, held doors a half second longer, made slightly more room in the service corridor. None of it dramatic, none of it named. Just a faint, almost atmospheric shift that happens in social ecosystems when something invisible has recalibrated the understanding of who someone is. On the fourth day, a man came in for lunch. Nora noticed him not because he was conspicuous, but because he was the opposite. Precisely, almost professionally inconspicuous. The kind of inconspicuous that takes effort. He sat at a small table near the window in Nora's section and ordered a coffee and the soup of the day and spent 90 minutes doing something on a tablet that he angled slightly away from the room. He was perhaps 38, with a lean, alert quality to him, and eyes that moved across the restaurant floor with the regular, calibrated sweep of someone cataloging rather than observing. He was not a food critic. Nora had served food critics. They had a different energy, hungry in the way of people who've been told their hunger matters. This man was something else. She couldn't have named it at the time. He tipped 30%, left no name on the card receipt, and did not return. On the sixth day, a Wednesday, the 20th of November, quiet for a midweek evening, Damien Voss came back. He came alone this time. She saw him from across the room before Petra saw him, before the host saw him, before anyone else in the restaurant had registered the particular shift in atmospheric pressure that accompanied him. He came through the door in a long dark overcoat he hadn't been wearing the last time, and he moved through the entrance process with the same contained efficiency she'd clocked the first night. No performance, no announcement, no concession to the social theater of being seen arriving. He was seated at table 7 again. Of course he was. Petra appeared at Nora's elbow. Within 30 seconds, Nora spoke first. "I know," she said. Petra looked at her. Then, "You also know, efficient, invisible, don't hover." "And," Petra said, with the slight additional weight of something unscripted, "whatever you did last time, the thing with merch, you clearly did it correctly." So, she walked away without completing the sentence. So was Petra's highest available form of praise. Nora filed it and moved toward table 7. He was already looking at the menu when she arrived, which was unusual. She had noticed last time that he ordered without consulting it. Tonight he held it open with both hands, not reading it the way people read menus, but looking at it the way people look at things when what they're actually doing is deciding something else. His coat was folded over the adjacent chair. His sleeves were rolled to the forearm, which was somehow a more human detail than anything else she had yet observed about him. The simple physical fact of cuffs turned back, of skin, and the faint suggestion of a watch on his left wrist. She approached at the correct angle. Not from behind, never from behind with a table like this. She had understood that instinctively on the first night, and the instinct felt more confirmed now. "Good evening," she said. "Can I start you with something to drink?" He looked up. This was the first time he had looked directly at her face. She had served him once before and he had not. Not rudely, not deliberately, but simply out of whatever orientation to the world kept his attention moving through it on a vertical plane that rarely arrived at the faces of service staff. Tonight was different. Tonight he looked up from the menu and he looked directly at her with those very dark and very still eyes, and the directness of it was not aggressive, not intimate, but simply complete, the way very few people ever looked at other people, without subtext, without performance, was the full economical weight of his attention. "Water," he said, "still, and a few more minutes with the menu." "Of course," she said. She turned to go. "Miss?" She turned back. He was looking at the menu again, or appearing to look at the menu again. He said without looking up, "The boy sends his regards." The sentence arrived in the space between them and sat there. Nora held very still. "That's kind of him," she said. "He asked me to return the book," Damien Voss said. And then he reached into the interior pocket of the coat folded over the adjacent chair and produced a small hardcover. Dark green, gold lettering, the same one she had seen in Eli's hand 6 nights ago, and set it on the corner of the table nearest to her. She looked at it. "I don't understand." "He says he noticed you looking at it." A pause. "He wants you to have it." Nora stood very still for a moment, with the particular stillness of someone recalibrating the shape of a situation. "He doesn't know me," she said. "No," Damien Voss agreed. But he has a theory about people who look at books the way you did. She should have left it there. She should have said something appropriate and moved on and maintained the professional distance that the situation, all of its invisible architecture, all of its weight and implication, clearly required. Instead, she said, "What theory?" And for the first time, the very first time in what she would later understand, was an event of genuine rarity. A movement crossed Damien Voss's face that was not controlled, not calibrated, not the product of discipline. Something almost like a smile, arriving and withdrawing in the same breath, like a light switched on in a far room and then off again before you could be sure you'd seen it. That people who look at books the way you did, he said, need them. The silence after that sentence had a texture to it, dense and particular, the kind of silence that closes around something true. "Still water," she said. "I'll be right back." She walked to the service station. She set both hands flat on the metal counter. She breathed. Simone materialized from somewhere. "What just happened?" "Nothing," Nora said. Simone looked at her face. "Okay," she said, in the tone of someone who means the precise opposite. Nora poured the water. She thought about a 9-year-old boy who had looked at her from across a room with the expression of someone who had been found, who had sent his book, the one he carried everywhere, the one whose spine he had gripped when a drunk man turned toward him with the full, careless weight of his attention, as a gift to a woman he had never spoken to, because he had a theory about people who needed things they didn't know how to ask for. She brought the water back. She set it down. She did not look at the book. She did not look at Damien Voss. "I'll be back in a few minutes," she said. "Miss Callahan," he said. She stopped. The use of her name, her full name, her last name, the name she had not given him, moved through the room like a stone through still. Water, perfectly controlled, precisely delivered. And the implicit message of it, the thing it said without saying, was not a threat. It was something more unsettling than a threat. It was acknowledgement. He knew who she was. He had learned who she was. And he wanted her to know that he had. She turned. "Yes?" He was looking at the menu again. "The branzino," he said. "Is it still the best thing on the menu?" She looked at him for exactly as long as was appropriate. "Yes," she said. "It always is." "Then I'll have that." She wrote it down on her pad. She capped her pen. "And Miss Callahan," she waited, "tell Eli he made a good choice." She walked away from the table, and she did not reach for the green book, not yet, but she felt it the way you feel something that has been placed into your gravity, orbiting, pulling slightly, already becoming part of the system before you've decided whether to let it in. She took the book home that night on the last bus. She sat by the window as in she always did, and she held it in her lap, and she looked at the cover in the amber light of the passing street lamps. It was a collection of stories, old ones, not fairy tales, but the kind of stories that had been told so many times and across so many languages that they had lost their single authorship and become simply true. The kind of stories that existed not because someone had invented them, but because human beings kept needing them in every era and every tongue. Inside the front cover, in the careful handwriting of a child who was still learning to make his letters permanent, it said, "For someone who looked, nothing else, no name, no date, just that." Nora sat with those 3 words for a long time, on the last bus going home, while the city unreeled itself in neon and darkness outside the window. She sat with them until the words stopped being words and became something else, a weight, warm and unexpected, held in a place in her chest that had been very quiet for a very long time. She thought about a boy who had watched her from across a restaurant and decided that she was a person who looked at things, who saw things, who noticed. She thought about what it meant that he had given away the thing he carried most carefully. She thought about his father. She thought about the way Damien Voss had said her name, her last name, the name of her mother's line, the name she carried as the only inheritance that couldn't be taken by creditors, not with menace, not with ownership, with the particular precision of a man who says a name because he has learned it and will not now pretend otherwise, because pretending is a kind of lie, and he does not. She was beginning to understand, deal in those. She thought, "I am in something now that I don't have the map for." And she thought with the quiet, slightly terrifying clarity of a woman who has finally stopped lying to herself about what she feels. I am not afraid, not of him, not of any of it, which was, as it turned out, the most dangerous thing about her. And somewhere across the city, in a room that cost more per night than Nora made in a month, a man who had not been surprised by anything in longer than he could clearly remember sat at a window and looked at the same city she was moving through and thought about a woman who had walked toward a table when every reasonable instinct should have kept her away from it, who had stood between a drunk and a child with nothing but a sentence and a stillness, who had held his son's gaze across a restaurant with a smile so small and so unhurried it was almost a secret. Caio Renner had given him the file that afternoon. Standard procedure, name, address, employment history, financial obligations, $41,000 in medical debt, a dead mother, no family that the search had found, no one watching out for her, no one who would notice if he had closed the file. Not because the information stopped being relevant, but because something about the act of reading it felt wrong in a way he wasn't prepared to examine. Like studying the architecture of a thing before deciding whether you have any right to enter it. Damien Voss had not felt uncertain in 3 years. He sat at the window and he looked at the city and he turned the feeling over in his hands like something unfamiliar and faintly expensive, something that required the kind of care you gave to things you didn't yet know the value of. He thought about Eli's face when he had explained on the way home that first night why he wanted to give the book away. She looked at it, Papa, Eli had said in the back of the car, in the particular earnest gravity of a child who is being entirely serious and needs you to understand that. The way Mama used to look at things she wanted to remember. Damien had not replied to that. He had looked out the car window for a long time. He had said finally, All right, you'll give it to her? All right, he'd said. Again, which meant yes, which meant more than yes, which meant that something his son had said had landed somewhere interior and undefended, and he would need time to understand what it had displaced. Now he sat at the window, and the city moved below him, and somewhere on a bus going south on Meridian Avenue, a woman with dark hair and $41,000 of debt was reading a note that his son had written in careful, still-forming letters for someone who looked. Damien pressed 2 fingers briefly to the bridge of his nose. He thought about the Branzino. He thought about the way she had said it always is. Not flattering, not performing, just stating a thing that would true in the flat, unhurried way of someone who tells the truth, not because they're trying to impress you, but because it hasn't occurred to them to do otherwise. He thought about what it meant that a 26-year-old waitress, with nothing but the right instincts and a very particular kind of stillness, had done. What no one in his immediate world would have dared to do. She had stepped between a threat and the thing he loved most, without being asked, without knowing what he was, or, and this was the thought that wouldn't quite leave him, without caring. He didn't know yet which of those was true. He intended to find out. If you're still here, still listening, still inside this story, then you already know this isn't just a story about power. Stay with it. The most important part is still coming. There is a particular kind of strength that the world doesn't have a good word for. Not courage. Courage implies the presence of fear overcome, and what Nora Callahan possessed was something quieter than that, something that operated below the level of conscious bravery. Not resilience. Resilience suggests recovery, the bouncing back from impact, and Nora had never quite had the luxury of bouncing. She had simply stayed standing, stayed working, stayed present in the specific and unglamorous way of people who understand that the alternative to enduring is not rest, but collapse. And collapse was not something she could afford. The world had a word for what women like Nora were called, when they were noticed at all. Strong. Said with a kind of admiring remove, the way you might compliment a structure for bearing weight. Strong. As though the weight were not the problem. As though the word itself were sufficient. Nora had stopped finding it sufficient a long time ago. But she had never stopped carrying the weight. November deepened into itself. The city shifted into the particular gray-blue register of a northern winter, settling in for the long occupation. The kind of cold that doesn't arrive all at once but accumulates layer by layer. until one morning you step outside and realize it has been cold for so long that you can no longer remember what warm felt like without effort. The streets got quieter after dark. The restaurant got louder. People in expensive coats came in from the cold and ordered things that cost more than Nora's daily wage and sat under the amber light and performed the rituals of abundance that were, she had come to understand, less about enjoyment than about the reassurance of capacity. The reassurance that you could be here, in this room, at this table, spending this much, and that this fact confirmed something essential about who you were. Nora moved through all of it with her customary steadiness. Damien Voss came to Callaway's 3 more times in the following 2 weeks. Always table 7, always the Branzino, always alone, always in the evening, always arriving with the same contained atmospheric authority that by now Nora had cataloged and filed and was trying, with diminishing success, to stop thinking about in the hours between his visits. He did not speak to her beyond what the transaction of service required. He was not cold. He was something more precise than cold, which was simply the application of exactly the appropriate amount of warmth for the nature of the interaction and nothing more. He tipped with the mathematical generosity of a man who understood the value of things without needing to announce it. He said good evening when she arrived at the table and thank you when she left it, and these phrases in his voice had a quality that distinguished them from the same phrases in other mouths. They were not social lubricant, not the verbal exhaust of a mind operating elsewhere, but delivered with the kind of full present attention that made ordinary words feel heavier than they usually were. He watched her, not in a way she could point to, not with the obviousness of a man who wants to be seen watching, but in the way that certain people watch things, with a peripheral consistency, a regular return of attention that once you've noticed it, you can't unnotice. She noticed it on his second visit back and said nothing. She noticed it more clearly on his third and said nothing. By his fourth visit, she had accepted the watching as a fact of the environment, the way you accept weather, not indifferent to it, but not surprised by it either. And she had begun to understand, with the careful, reluctant intelligence of a woman who has survived by reading rooms accurately, that the watching was not casual, that it had a quality of assessment to it, that Damien Voss was a man who moved through the world in a permanent state of evaluation, gathering information, processing it, reaching conclusions he did not share, and that she had, for reasons she hadn't yet fully mapped, become something he was evaluating. She had read the Green Book, all of it over the course of a week, in the 30-minute increments her schedule permitted, on the bus, at the kitchen table before her shifts, once propped against her pillow at midnight, when sleep had failed to arrive and she'd reached for it in the dark without deciding to. The stories were old and exact and quietly devastating in the way of things that have had centuries to distill themselves into their truest form. There was one near the middle of the collection about a woman who builds a house on the edge of a forest and lives in it alone for so many years that the forest begins to grow up through the floors, through the walls, through the ceiling, until it is no longer clear where the house ends and the forest begins. And the woman does not stop it because the forest is the only thing that has ever grown toward her without being asked. She had read that one 3 times. She had thought about Eli, who had carried this book everywhere, who had selected it from whatever collection was available to him. And she could imagine, in the quietly furnished rooms of a wealthy and grief-shaped household, a considerable collection, and had chosen this one to carry, had chosen these particular stories, these old and exact and quietly devastating ones, to keep near his body as he moved through the world. She thought about what that said about what he needed. She thought about it, and she ached in the specific way you ache for children who have had to become sophisticated before their time, who have learned the language of loss before the language of safety. She thought more than she should have about his father. On the 29th of November, Victor Crane found her. She had not thought about Victor Crane in several months, which was how she preferred to operate with regard to Victor Crane. Not thinking about him, not anticipating him, not giving him the real estate in her mind that the situation technically warranted, but that she refused to allocate because allocating it felt like conceding something. He was a fact of her life, in the category of facts she had decided to manage rather than fear. The medical debt was in his portfolio now, had been since a week after her mother's death, when the original creditor had sold it in the casual. administrative way of institutions offloading inconvenient grief. Crane ran a collections operation that occupied a legal space precise enough to function, but gray enough at the edges to do things that cleaner operations couldn't. He had called her twice in October. She had made partial payments both times. He came to the restaurant on a Saturday afternoon before her shift, when she was coming in through the staff entrance, with her coat over her arm and her hair still loose, which meant she was not yet armored for the evening, not yet in the configuration of herself that she used for work. He was waiting at the end of the service alley, which told her he had done research, had learned her schedule, had decided that the staff entrance at 4:15 was a better place to find her than her apartment, which told her the apartment address was also something he possessed. Victor Crane was 53 years old and looked like a man who had spent decades in the specific business of pursuing people who didn't want to be found. He was not physically intimidating. Medium height, unremarkable build, a face that was carefully ordinary in the way of a tool selected for its function rather than its form. He wore a coat that was expensive enough to communicate seriousness without communicating excess. And he stood at the end of the alley with his hands in his pockets and his posture relaxed, in a way that was not actual relaxation, but the performance of it, designed to suggest that this encounter was inevitable and casual, and that she should not bother to run the numbers because he had already run them for her. "Miss Callahan," he said. She stopped. She recalibrated quickly, the thing she was good at, the constant internal adjustment required by a life that rarely gave you time to brace. She held her coat and she looked at him and she said, "Mr. Crane, you've been inconsistent," he said, not angry, informational. October's second payment was 14 days late. This month's was short by 240. "I had an emergency expense," she said. "You always do," he said, still not angry. Almost sympathetic in the specific way of people whose sympathy is a tool. "That's the nature of your situation, Miss Callahan. It doesn't change the obligation." "I know what my obligation is," she said. "The interest has accrued," he said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document and held it out. She took it because not taking it would have been the more frightening choice. She looked at it. The number at the bottom was not what she had thought the number was. It was not even close to what she had thought the number was. "This isn't right," she said. "It's accurate," he said. "Compound interest, service fees, the late penalties from October. It's all itemized." She looked at the number again. It had grown in a way that felt less like mathematics and more like something organic and malevolent, the way mold grows. Not because it intends harm, but because growth is simply what it does in the conditions you've provided for it. "I can't pay this," she said. The words cost her something to say, not pride exactly. She had made her peace with needing to say things like this when, with the specific expenditure of energy that went into admitting out loud that a number was larger than you. "You'll need to make arrangements," Crane said. "Accelerated payments, or we discuss alternative resolutions." "What does that mean?" she said. He smiled. It was not an unpleasant smile, which was the most unpleasant thing about it. "It means I'm flexible for the right structure. There are things I need done, administrative things, record keeping, for which I need people who are already embedded in certain environments, certain clientele." She understood then, completely immediately, with the clarity of a person who has been maneuvered before and learned to recognize the geometry of it. He wanted information about who came to Callaway's, about who sat at which tables and spoke to which people, and ordered what and arrived with whom. He wanted her to be his eyes in a room that certain people use with the expectation of privacy. She looked at Victor Crane for a long moment. "No," she said. His smile didn't change. "Miss Callahan." "No," she said again. The same word, the same volume, the same flat and total register. "I won't do that. Bill me for whatever you need to bill me for. Take whatever legal action you're entitled to take, but I won't do that." "The legal action," he said pleasantly, "would include garnishment, your wages, for the foreseeable future." "Then garnish them," she said. A pause. The first genuine pause of the conversation, the first moment in which something in his calibration shifted, because he had expected something else here. Capitulation, with tears or negotiation, any of the normal responses of a person being cornered, and she had given him instead the response of someone who has decided which thing she is willing to lose and which thing she is not. Think about it, he said. I have, she said. The answer is no. She walked past him and into the building, and she did not let herself shake until she was in the staff bathroom with the door locked and the tap running, and then she let herself shake for 90 seconds, which was all the time she could afford, and then she turned off the tap and looked at her face in the mirror and breathed. She thought, this is going to get worse before it stops. She was right. She told no one. Not Simone, who would have worried in the loud and affectionate way that Simone worried, which Nora loved but could not currently carry. Not Petra, who might have felt it reflected on the restaurant. Not anyone, because there was no one in her life who existed in the space between knowing and being able to help, and telling people things that frightened you without any mechanism for their help was just distributing your fear, making others hold it without reducing it. And Nora had never been able to do that. She worked her shift that night without the weight of it showing. She was good at that. She was so good at that most people who looked at her saw only the surface. The competence, the composure, the unobtrusive efficiency, and did not think to wonder what was being spent to maintain it. What it cost over the course of a month, a year, a life, to perform steadiness so consistently that it eventually became indistinguishable from the real thing. Damien Voss came in that night. She hadn't expected him. He'd been in 4 days ago, and his pattern, such as she'd begun to read it, suggested a weekly rhythm. But there he was at table 7 at 8 o'clock. And the room did its usual invisible recalibration around him, and Petra materialized at Nora's elbow as though summoned by a frequency only she could hear. Nora went to the table. He looked up at her immediately this time. No delay. No pretense of menu consultation. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for 2 weeks, with that dark and comprehensive attention, and something in his expression did something she hadn't seen it do before. It stilled. Not the usual stillness, not the controlled, deliberate flatness that was his resting register, but something more interior than that. Something that looked briefly like recognition of a specific kind. The recognition of a person who reads, faces for survival, noticing something in another face that they know the shape of. Good evening, she said. Miss Callahan, he said. The usual? Yes. A pause. Sit down. The words arrived without preamble, without softening, without any of the social scaffolding that requests of this kind were supposed to come wrapped in. Not a question, not a suggestion. 2 words stated in the level, certain voice of a man who said things once. Nora looked at him. I'm working, she said. I know, he said. Sit down. She should have refused. There were 100 reasons to refuse, beginning with professional context and ending somewhere in the general territory of self-preservation. She knew what this man was, or she knew the outline of it, the silhouette, the shape that his presence in a room drew in the air around him. She knew that sitting down at his table, crossing from the side of service into the side of conversation, was a line that once crossed could not be uncrossed. She sat down. He looked at her. She looked at him. The restaurant moved around them in its amber and its noise, and they occupied a small pocket of quiet within it. Something happened today, he said. It wasn't a question. She said nothing. Before your shift, he said, someone came to the staff entrance. She held very still. You have someone watching this building. I have someone watching this block, he said. It's not the same thing. Another pause. Victor Crane. Her name for the feeling that moved through her in that moment was not fear. It was something more complex than fear. The vertiginous awareness of being further inside a situation than you realized, of looking for the walls and finding them further away than you'd thought, and further away in every direction. That's my business, she said. Yes, he said, it is. He did not argue with that. He acknowledged it with the simplicity of a man who knows the difference between what is his and what is not and does not habitually confuse them. I want to ask you something. She waited. What did he want? She looked at Damien Voss's face, at the dark and steady eyes, the jaw that carried its tension, the quality of stillness that was neither cold nor warm, but something more elemental than temperature. the stillness of deep water, of things with mass. Information, she said, about this restaurant, about the people who come here. And you said, no, she said. Something moved in his face, small, deep. Why? Because it wasn't mine to give, she said. Other people's privacy isn't a currency. The silence after that lasted long enough to have a temperature. He'll come back, Damien said. I know, she said. He'll escalate. Probably. And you'll say no again. It wasn't a question. He said it the way he said most things. As an observation, as a fact he had already processed and filed. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a long time. She did not fill the silence. She had learned somewhere in the education that her life had provided that silence was often more useful than the words people reached for to end it, and she had become someone who could sit inside it without flinching. Eli has been asking about you, Damien said finally. The shift in subject was deliberate. A door opened in a different direction, and she understood she was meant to go through it. What does he ask? She said. Whether you've read the book. A pause. I told him I hadn't asked. I have, she said, all of it. Which story? She understood immediately that this was a test, not a hostile test. There was nothing hostile in Damien Voss's interaction with her, which was itself a thing she was still adjusting to. But a test, the way all of his questions were tests, precise instruments for information. The one about the woman and the forest, she said. He was quiet. And in the quality of the quiet she understood, with the particular clarity of someone who reads things accurately, that this was also the one he would have chosen, or the one that would have chosen him. He'll want to know what you thought of it, Damien said. Tell him, she said, that I thought the woman made the right choice, letting the forest in. Something happened in Damien Voss's face that she had not seen there before, and would not see there again for some time. Something unguarded, something that arrived without permission, something that looked like it hurt faintly in the way that beauty sometimes hurts, in the way of things that remind you of what you've lost. He looked away, out toward the room, the amber light, the other tables. Caio will speak with Crane, he said. His voice had returned to its operational register, controlled, flat, forward-moving, a man who has allowed something and is now returning to the architecture of himself. The obligation will be resolved. The words landed on her like something physical. She sat very straight. No, she said. He looked back at her. No, she said again. I don't want that. It's $41,000, he said. Not callously, just a fact that he had clearly known for some time. It's my $41,000, she said. My mother's debt, my obligation. I'll pay it. I will manage Victor Crane, she said. And her voice in that moment had a quality that she was aware of even as she produced it, the quality of absolute certainty, of a line drawn in a place that was not negotiable, of a woman who has decided the thing she is, and will not be moved from it by money or power or the well-intentioned interventions of either. Thank you, but no. The look he gave her then was not new exactly, but more concentrated than what she'd seen before. Like something that had been building focus across the past 2 weeks had arrived at its sharpest point. Why? He said, one word. Because, she said, I don't want to owe you. He held her gaze. You wouldn't, he said. I'm not Crane. I know, she said. That's not the point. Another silence. And in this one, she felt something shift. Not retreat, not disappointment, but adjustment. The adjustment of a man who has encountered a response he didn't fully anticipate and is processing it with genuine attention rather than dismissing it. All right, he said. She stood up, smoothed her apron, looked at him once more. The branzino, she said. I'll put the order in. Yes, he said. She walked away from the table, and she did not let her hands shake, and she did not let her face do anything, and she was very nearly at the service station before she became aware that she was breathing too carefully, the way you breathe when you're concentrating very hard on a single thing and everything else is running on reserve. Simona was waiting at the station. She took one look at Nora's face and said nothing. She poured Nora a glass of water and set it on the counter and stepped discreetly to the other side of the station and began polishing glasses with elaborate focus. Nora drank the water. She put the order in. She thought about a man who had just offered to erase the number that had shaped the last 14 months of her life, and who had accepted her refusal without argument, without maneuvering, without any of the usual attempts to reframe or redirect that characterized people who were not genuinely taking no for an answer. He had simply said all right, as though her no were a complete sentence, as though it required nothing further, as though the boundaries of another person were, to him, simply a fact of the geography. She thought about how rare that was. She thought about the woman in the story and the forest growing up through the floors, and whether there was a difference between letting something in and being grown into. She thought about Eli's careful handwriting. For someone who looked, she picked up the branzino when it came out of the kitchen and carried it to table 7 and set it down. And when she straightened up, Damien Voss looked at her with those dark and steady eyes and said very quietly, as though the words were for her alone in the full and deliberate sense of that phrase, "He was right about you." She did not ask who he meant. She knew who he meant. "Enjoy your dinner," she said. She walked back to her section. Outside, in the narrow service alley behind Callaway's, Victor Crane's name was being relayed by text to a man named K.O. Renner, who was sitting in a car around the corner. Nora didn't know that. Yet, she didn't know that even as she had said no, clearly, firmly, with the full weight of her considerable will, the wheels of a world she hadn't chosen were already turning in her direction. Not overruling her, not ignoring her refusal, but circling it, holding it, protecting the space around it the way you protect something that doesn't know yet it needs protecting. The way you stand at the edge of someone's life, very quietly, because you have seen what they carry and you have decided, without announcing it, without asking permission, that you are not going to look away. There is a moment in every carefully constructed life when the architecture fails, not because it was built badly, not because the person inside it wasn't vigilant enough or strong enough or sufficiently committed to the maintenance of all those small, careful structures that keep a life functional against the pressure of everything trying to unmake it. The architecture fails because pressure is patient in a way that people cannot be. Because the world does not tire of pushing against the things you've built to hold it back. Because there are mornings when you wake up and the weight you've been carrying has quietly, in the night, become heavier than the person carrying it. Nora Callahan reached that morning on December the 9th. She didn't recognize it as a breaking point when she woke up because breaking points rarely announce themselves. She woke to the sound of the radiator, its familiar metallic complaint, the knock and hiss that had become so embedded in her sleep that silence would have woken her faster. And she lay in the thin morning light and felt the weight of everything settle onto her chest with a completeness that was different from the usual. Not new weight, the same weight. Just somehow, this morning, all of it at once. The debt, which Victor Crane had restructured in the 2 weeks since their encounter at the staff entrance, arriving in her mailbox in a new document with a new set of terms that were worse than the previous ones in ways that were legally precise and humanly brutal. The number had grown again, not unreasonably by the logic of the system that produced it, but unreasonably by every other logic she possessed. The letter from the city tax office, which had arrived the previous week regarding the property taxes on the Deering Street apartment, her lease, she now understood, had a clause she hadn't read carefully enough, and there was an outstanding amount that technically passed to tenants in certain conditions. And the city had recently begun enforcing conditions it had previously overlooked. And the amount was not enormous, but it was not nothing. And nothing was currently what she had. Her left wrist, which she had rolled awkwardly, carrying a heavy tray 3 nights ago and which had been protesting ever since, with the specific insistence of a minor injury that would be fine with rest but was not being given any. The absence, as always, of her mother. That last one had no document, no dollar amount, no legal framework. It was simply there, the way it was always there, the shapeless and omnipresent weight of a person whose presence had once made all the other weights manageable and who was now simply gone. Gone in the complete and permanent sense of that word that Nora had spent 14 months not looking at directly, because looking at it directly was not something she could afford to do and still function. She lay in bed for 11 minutes, 4 longer than usual, and she noticed the excess, and she let herself have it, and then she got up. She made coffee. She stood in her narrow kitchen in the gray December light, and she drank it standing up, because sitting down in the morning felt too much like rest, and she did not trust herself with rest today. She looked at the green book on her kitchen table. She had been returning to it in increments all month, not rereading it cover to cover, but the way you return to music that matches a mood, opening to wherever it fell open, reading a page or three, closing it again. It had become part of the furniture of her small life in a way that she had not decided and had not prevented. She had not seen Damien Voss in 11 days. She had not counted the days. She was aware of approximately how many there were in the way that you're aware of the length of a silence, not because you're timing it, but because silence has a texture that shifts the longer it extends. She put on her coat and went to work. The shift that day was a lunch service, which was not Nora's usual, and she was predominantly evenings, but Simone had asked her to cover, and Nora had said yes because Simone asked for things so rarely and with such apologetic grace that refusing felt like cruelty. The lunch crowd at Callaway's was different from the dinner crowd in ways that Nora had always found interesting. Dinner was performance, people constructing, people themselves for the evening, for their companions, for the ambient, social theater of being seen in a place that required a certain kind of person to enter it. Lunch was more functional. The tables were filled with people doing business, running through agendas, eating quickly enough to suggest they had somewhere more important to be. Less ceremony, more transaction. She was managing 3 tables at once just after noon when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She ignored it. She brought the arugula salad to table 3 and the risotto to table 6 and the still water to table 9, and she moved back to the service station and checked the phone in the 30-second window between demands. Victor Crane. Not a call, a text, which was new. He had always called before. The shift to text felt like escalation in the way of things that move from verbal to written, from negotiable to documented. You have until December 31st to pay the full outstanding balance, or I begin garnishment proceedings. This is your final courtesy notice. She read it twice, put the phone back in her pocket, picked up a tray. The number was not payable by December 31st. The number was not payable by any date she could project on her current income trajectory without some intervention that she could not imagine the shape of. She had done the math in every configuration available to her, and the math came out the same way each time, with the remorseless consistency of mathematics, which does not care about effort or intention or the specific human texture of how you arrived at your deficit. She carried the tray to table 4. She smiled at the woman who was asking about the soup. She told her about the soup. She was walking back across the floor when she felt it. That particular atmospheric shift, the slight recalibration of the room's ambient energy, subtle and reliable as a barometric change, she turned. Damien Voss was not at table 7. He was standing near the entrance, still in his coat, speaking quietly with the host. Not the usual host, a different one. A young man named Theo, who was doing his best to project competence under pressure, and the pressure in question was visible in the precise set of his shoulders, in the way his eyes kept making small involuntary contact with Nora across the room. Damien had clearly not intended to be here at lunch. He was dressed differently from his evening configurations. Still impeccable, still the particular kind of put together that required no adjustment, but in a heavier coat and with the quality of a man who has come from somewhere and is going somewhere and has stopped here for reasons that were not originally on the itinerary. Their eyes met across the restaurant. She looked away first. She had to. She had a table waiting. A couple at table 2 who had been holding their menus for 3 minutes and were reaching the end of the patience that politeness extends to service staff before it becomes expectation. She went to table 2. She took their order. She was turning away when she became aware that Damien Voss was now seated at a small table near the window, and not table 7, which was occupied, but a 2-top against the east wall, and that Theo had apparently navigated the situation with enough grace not to require rescue. She was not supposed to be covering this section. She covered it anyway. "You don't usually come at lunch," she said when she reached the table. Not a challenge, just a statement of something they both knew. "No," he agreed. "Were you passing?" "No," he said again. She looked at him. "Water?" "Yes." He paused. "And whatever you recommend for lunch." It was the first time he had deferred to her on a menu decision. She filed it in the ongoing document she was keeping, without meaning to. Of the small and significant things Damien Voss did differently with her than she imagined he did with most people. The mushroom risotto, she said. It's what the, she said, kitchen does best at lunch. Then that, he said, she turned to go. Nora. Her first name, not Miss Callahan, not the formal, precise surname first address that he had used every other time. Her name. Her first name in his voice, which was low and exact, and made the word feel like something carefully handled. She turned back. He was looking at her with the dark and comprehensive attention she had come to know, but something in it today was different. The usual quality of it, as the assessment, the evaluation, the gathering of information, was present, but underneath it was something else. Something that looked, she thought, like concern. Not performed concern, not the social gesture of concern. The actual thing, quiet and slightly uncomfortable, the concern of someone who's not accustomed to feeling it and has not yet made peace with the feeling. Are you all right? He said. The question arrived in her chest before it arrived in her mind. She stood very still. Yes, she said. The word was out before she'd decided on it. Reflex rather than choice. The automatic response of someone for whom are you all right had always been a question that required the answer. Yes, regardless of the truth. Because the truth was not something the questioner was usually equipped to hold. He looked at her. You don't have to, he started. I'm fine, she said. More firmly. The extra firmness was a mistake, and she knew it immediately, because people who are actually fine do not say it with emphasis. He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded once and looked at the table. The risotto, he said, returning them to the transaction, giving her back the ground she'd claimed. She went and put the order in, and she stood at the service station, and she thought about the word Nora in his voice, the specific weight of it, the way it had arrived without announcement, without the formal scaffolding of surname and title that he had maintained for weeks. She thought about what it meant that he had come here at lunch, that he had sat somewhere other than his usual table, that he had asked her recommendation, that he had looked at her face and seen something there that had produced in him a question. Are you all right? She thought. He already knows I'm not. She thought. He came anyway. She thought. This is becoming something I don't have a name for. She gave it a name 3 hours later, and the name was Crisis, though not the kind she'd expected. She left Callaway's at 3:15, the lunch service done, with 4 hours before her evening shift began. She took the longer route home, an old habit, something she'd done since childhood when she needed to think, the use of distance as a container for whatever needed containing. She was 2 blocks from the restaurant, on a side street that cut between the commercial strip and a quieter residential row, when she heard footsteps behind her and felt, with the animal accuracy of a woman who had learned early to listen for such things, that the footsteps were not coincidental. She turned. 2 men she didn't know, both large, both unremarkably dressed, both with the particular quality of stillness that men have when they're waiting for a cue rather than acting on impulse. Behind them, at the end of the block, a car she also didn't know. And leaning against the car, with his hands in the pockets of his expensive ordinary coat, watching her with the relaxed patience of a man who has timed his arrival correctly. Victor Crane. Miss Callahan, he said from the end of the block. Not advancing, not shouting, just I'm present. In the specific way of someone who wants you to understand the geometry of the situation before any words are exchanged. I thought we might continue our conversation. She looked at him. She looked at the 2 men. She ran the geography in her head. The distance to the restaurant, to the nearest cross street, to the residential block that would have people in it at this hour. She ran it quickly, the way you run calculations when the stakes are the kind that clarify the mind entirely. There's nothing to continue, she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of it. I disagree, Crane said pleasantly. He began to walk toward her, unhurried. The 2 men shifted slightly but did not advance. You've made a decision that I'd like you to reconsider, that's all, just a conversation. I've made my position clear, she said. You have, he agreed. And I respect that, I do. But I want you to understand something, Miss Callahan. that I think you may have overlooked. He was close enough now that she could see his face clearly, the careful, ordinary face with its carefully pleasant expression. You have no one watching out for you. You understand that? No family, no connections. You're a very capable woman on a very thin edge, and the edge is getting thinner, and I am the only person standing between you and the drop. She said nothing. I'm not a villain, he said. I'm an option, a solution. All I need is. The answer is no. The voice came from behind her. She turned. Kaio Renner was standing 6 feet away with his hands loose at his sides and his face carrying the particular expression of someone who has arrived at a predetermined conclusion and is now simply in the process of delivering it. He was not large in the way of men who rely on size. He was lean and still and precise, with the quality of something efficient. Behind him, parked at the near end of the block, another car, and behind Kaio, standing with the same controlled, unhurried authority that he brought to every room he entered, his coat dark against the pale December afternoon, Damien Voss. He was not looking at Crane, he was looking at Nora, and in his face, in those dark and steady eyes, and was an expression she had not seen there before. Not in all the weeks of watching and being watched, not in any of the conversations at table 7 or the careful silences between them. It was not anger. It was something quieter and more total than anger. It was the expression of a man who has been containing something for a very long time and has arrived, without drama, without announcement, at the moment when containment is no longer the appropriate response. Victor Crane had gone very still. The two men behind Nora had also gone still, and the stillness of them was different now. Not the focused stillness of men waiting for a cue, but the particular stillness of men who have recognized that the situation has reclassified itself and are waiting to understand what that means for them. Damien walked forward, not fast, not slow, the precise pace of a man who has never needed to hurry in order to arrive where he intends to be. He stopped beside Nora. Not in front of her, not between her and Crane, in the obvious performative placement of protection, beside her, level with her, as though they were standing on the same ground, which they were, she realized, in more than the physical sense. He looked at Victor Crane. You have an outstanding obligation, Damien said. The words were spoken in his operational voice, the low, even forward-moving voice that carried no emotion and required none, because the weight behind it was not emotional. It was structural. The weight of a man who has spent decades being the most consequential thing in any room he entered and has never once needed to prove it. From 2019, property acquisition irregularities in the 4th District, I believe the Hendricks file. Crane had gone the color of old paper. That's, he started. Resolved as of this morning, Damien said. I've had it resolved, along with Miss Callahan's outstanding balance, which has been purchased from your portfolio at face value. You can't. I have, Damien said. It's done. Crane looked at him for a long moment, then he looked at Nora, then back at Damien, and in his face was the expression of a man doing the arithmetic of a situation and finding that all the numbers have changed simultaneously, that he has arrived with a handful of cards that were worth something an hour ago and are now worth nothing, and that the most functional response is a graceful and rapid exit. He straightened his coat. Good afternoon, Miss Callahan, he said. He walked back to his car. The two men followed him. The car left the block with the contained speed of a vehicle that's leaving without appearing to flee, which required a specific kind of self-conscious driving. Silence fell over the block. Nora stood in it for a moment. Beside her, Damien Voss looked at the space where the car had been. Kaio had drifted back to the other car, with the discreet efficiency of a man who understands when his presence is no longer the point. You followed me, Nora said. Kaio was nearby, Damien said. You were having lunch, she said. You left the restaurant and you followed me. You were 2 blocks from the restaurant. And Crane's car had been on this street for 20 minutes before you turned onto it, he said. Not defensive, not apologetic, informational. I told you I didn't want your help, she said. With the debt, he said. You told me you didn't want help with the debt. This was not the debt, he said. This was a man with 2 associates on a quiet street. She turned to face him. He was looking at her now, and the expression was still there. The contained and total thing, that was quieter than anger but heavier, and being the object of it at close range was a different experience than observing it from across a restaurant. "You bought my debt," she said. "Yes," he said. "I told you I wouldn't owe you." "You don't," he said. "I bought it and I'm canceling it. It's done. There's nothing to owe." She stared at him. "You can't just—" "I can," he said simply. "I have." Damien. His name for the first time in her voice. She hadn't planned it. It arrived because the situation had become too large for formal address, because she was standing on a cold December street with her hands shaking very slightly inside her coat pockets, and the man beside her had just erased the number that had defined the last 14 months of her life and was looking at her with that expression, and she was, "Don't," he said quietly. She stopped. "Don't thank me," he said, "and don't argue with me. Not about this." She looked at him. "Why?" she said. The same question he had asked her weeks ago, and she had answered with, "Because it wasn't mine to give." He was quiet for a moment. The December air moved between them, cold and still. "Because," he said, "you stood between a man and my son without knowing what it would cost you." A pause. "And it cost you, and you still wouldn't take the out I offered." She said nothing. "And because," he said more quietly, in the register of a man saying something he has not rehearsed, "Eli has been asking about you every day for 3 weeks, and I have run out of answers that satisfy him." The words settled into the cold air. She thought about a 9-year-old boy with a green book and careful handwriting. She thought about, for someone who looked, she thought about the woman in the story and the forest growing through the floors, and whether there was a difference between letting something in and being grown into. She thought she was beginning to understand that there wasn't. "What does he ask?" she said. Damien looked at her. "He asks," he said slowly, "whether you're all right." The words landed on her like a hand placed carefully on a wound. Whether you're all right. A 9-year-old boy, in whatever room he occupied in whatever house his father had built around the absence of his mother, asking every day whether she was all right. Not because she had given him anything remarkable, because she had seen him, because she had stood up from her correct position and placed herself between him and something that was moving in his direction, and he had noticed, and it had mattered, and he was 9 years old, and it had mattered. She felt the thing in her chest that she had been containing all day, all week, all month, all 14 months, shift. Not break, not collapse, shift. The way tectonic things shift, slowly, and with enormous force, and with the permanent alteration of everything on the surface. Her eyes did something she had not allowed them to do in a very long time. She turned away from him slightly. She looked at the end of the street, at the pale December afternoon, at the city continuing its enormous indifferent life around this small and quiet block. She breathed. "Tell him," she said, when she was certain of her voice, "that I'm all right." "Are you?" he said. She turned back. She looked at Damien Voss, this man with his grief and his power, and his son who sent books to women, who looked at them, and his own unreadable interior, which she had been reading in fragments for weeks, and which she was beginning to understand was not as unreadable as it appeared, which was simply read by very few people, because very few people had been paying the right kind of attention. "I will be," she said. "I think I will be." He nodded. "Once." The nod of a man who accepts an answer and does not demand that it be more than it is. "I'll walk you back," he said. "To the restaurant?" "To wherever you're going," he said. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about saying no. She thought about all the reasons to say no, the distance it would cross, the lines it would move, the implications of a man like Damien Voss walking beside a woman like Nora Callahan down a street in the middle of a December afternoon. She thought about a child asking every day whether she was all right. "I was going home," she said. "It's 15 minutes. "All right," he said. He fell into step beside her. They walked. The city moved around them in its gray and ordinary December. Light. They did not speak immediately, and the silence between them had a quality she recognized. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who have more to say than the moment has yet made room for, and who have both, independently, decided to wait for room. After half a block, he said, "The story." The Woman and the Forest. Yes, she said. Mara used to read to him, he said, at night. She collected things like that. Old stories. Mara, his wife, Eli's mother. The name said plainly, in a voice that had clearly said it thousands of times and had learned to say it without fracturing, though not without cost. He chose well, Nora said carefully. The book. He chooses everything carefully, Damien said. He always has, even before he stopped, even when he was very small. She listened to what he hadn't finished saying. He's remarkable, she said, and she meant it in the full and specific sense of the word, not as a social nicety, not as the compliment you pay to someone's child, but as a genuine observation about a person she had encountered briefly and would not forget. Damien was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said, he is. And the way he said it, with a simplicity that contained multitudes, with the stripped and honest pride of a man who knows exactly what he has been given and what it cost and what it means, told Nora more about Damien Voss than anything he had said across all the evenings at Table 7. They reached her building on Deering Street. She stopped on the step. He stopped beside her. She looked at him. Thank you, she said, and she meant it for more than the street, more than Crane, more than the debt. She meant it for the walk, for the silence that had room in it, for the way he had said Mara's name without asking her to react to it. Eli will want to see you, he said. He'll want to know you're all right for himself. I know, she said. Would that be? Yes, she said. He nodded. Saturday, he said, if you're not working. I'm not, she said. Another nod. He looked at her once more, with those eyes, with that expression that was not quite the one she'd seen on the street, but was related to it, was descended from it, and then he turned and walked back in the direction they'd come from, his coat dark against the pale afternoon. She watched him go. She thought, I am inside something now. She thought, I think I have been for a while. She thought, I think that might be all right. She went inside. She climbed the stairs to her apartment. She sat at her kitchen table with the green book in front of her, and she opened it to the story about the woman in the forest. And she read it again, slowly, for the fourth time. And this time she noticed something she hadn't noticed in the previous 3 readings. At the end of the story, the very last line, which she had read before without it landing quite this way, when the narrator says, the forest did not ask permission to grow. It simply grew toward the light it found. She sat with that line for a long time. Outside, the December light was fading. The radiator knocked. The city moved in its endless, patient life beyond the window that faced the brick wall. Nora Callahan sat at her kitchen table in the gathering dark, and she let herself feel, for the first time in a very long time, the specific and terrifying and necessary thing that happens when you stop bracing against the world and simply let it find you where you are. She let herself feel something that might have been hope, small and careful and not yet named, but real, undeniably, stubbornly, quietly real. There are things that cannot be rushed, not because rushing them would make them arrive broken, though it would, but because the time between the wanting and the having is not empty time. It is not wasted time. It is the time in which you become the person capable of holding what you've been waiting for. The time in which the interior rearranges itself to accommodate something new without collapsing under it. The time in which trust is built, the only way it can be built, not through grand gestures or declarations, but through the slow, unremarkable accumulation of moments in which someone could have failed you and didn't. Nora understood this in the way she understood most things, not as a theory, but as a fact of her own lived experience, earned through years of discovering what it cost to skip it. She would not skip it now. Saturday arrived the way December Saturdays arrive in cold cities, gray and quiet and somehow more honest than weekdays, stripped of the performance of productivity, left with only what was actually there. She had not slept well. Not from anxiety exactly, but from the particular wakefulness of a mind that has been reorganizing itself, moving furniture around in the interior, deciding what could stay and what needed to be set down, discovering in the process rooms she hadn't known were there, rooms that had been closed for so long they had begun to feel like walls. She dressed carefully without meaning to. She noticed herself being careful about it and stopped, laughed quietly at herself in the mirror, a small and private laugh, the kind you share with yourself when you catch yourself doing something human, and then continue being careful about it anyway because honesty is not the same as indifference. A car arrived on Deering Street at 10 in the morning. Not Damien's car. A different one, quieter and unassuming in the way of things that don't want to announce themselves. Kaio was driving. He didn't get out. He simply pulled to the curb and waited, and Nora came out of her building with her coat buttoned and her hair down. She had decided on the hair, hadn't made the decision deliberately, was aware of what it meant to show up somewhere without the armor of her work configuration, and got in. Kaio said good morning, and she said good morning, and they drove in a silence that was not uncomfortable, because Kaio Renner had the quality of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that most things did not require him to speak. She watched the city change around her as they drove. Not dramatically, not the stark cinematic shift of one world replaced by another, which was how these transitions were usually depicted in the stories people told about the distance between ordinary lives and powerful ones. The city changed gradually, the way all real transitions change. Incrementally, almost imperceptibly, neighborhood bleeding into neighborhood, one kind of building becoming another, the ratio of light to shadow shifting, the streets widening slightly, the trees becoming more numerous and more deliberately placed. They stopped in front of a house. She had not known exactly what to expect. She had imagined, in the uncontrolled way of a mind that has been given insufficient data and fills the gap with inference, something imposing. Something that announced itself in the way Damien Voss announced himself. With density, with a sense of compressed weight, with the atmosphere of consequence. The house was not that. It was large and genuinely large. Set back from the street behind a low stone wall and a line of old trees that had been there longer than the house and would be there after it. But its scale read as lived in rather than performative. The stone was weathered. The windows were generous and unguarded. There was a light on in a room on the second floor that glowed amber against the gray morning, and something about that specific amber light, small and warm in the gray December face of the house, undid a tension in her chest she hadn't been fully aware of carrying. Someone was home. Someone was in there, in that lit room, and they were waiting. Kaio said nothing. She got out of the car. Eli opened the door before she reached it. He must have been watching from somewhere. The window, the side light beside the entrance, because the door opened at precisely the moment she arrived at the top of the stone steps, with the exact timing of someone who has been waiting and has now decided that waiting is finished. He was wearing a dark green sweater, and she thought of the book. Of course, she thought of the book and wondered if the color was coincidence, and suspected it was not. And his dark hair was slightly unbrushed on one side, in the way of children who have been sitting for long periods against cushions. And he looked at her with those watchful and careful eyes and said, with the grave formality of a child who is deeply glad to see someone and is managing it, "You came." "I said I would," she said. He considered this. "People say things," he said. "Yes," she said, "they do." A pause. He looked at her face with the particular attention of a child who reads people the way adults read documents, carefully, looking for the discrepancy between what is stated and what is true. When whatever he found seemed to satisfy him. "Come in," he said. "I made something." She came in. The interior of the house was warm. That was the word that arrived first and stayed. Not in the temperature sense alone, though. It was that, too. The specific warmth of a house with good heating and heavy curtains in rooms that had been lived in long enough to absorb the accumulated warmth of the lives inside them. Warm in the way of a place that had once been full and was still, despite loss, in the process of being full again. There were books everywhere, not displayed, not decorative, but present in the organic way of things that are used, stacked on surfaces and tucked into corners and left open on chairs, with the casual permanence of an ongoing conversation. There were drawings on the wall in the hallway, small ones framed simply, a child's hand in some, and something more practiced in others. She stopped at one. It was a forest, rendered in pencil, with the tentative and specific care of a child who was still learning what his hands could do. Trees close together, dense and intricate, and at the center of them, very small, a figure standing with its face turned upward. I drew that, Eli said from beside her. When? She said. After I read the story, he said. The one about the woman. He paused. I gave you the book before I drew it, but I remembered it. She looked at the drawing for a long moment, at the figure at the center, small among the trees, face lifted. It's beautiful, Eli, she said. It's not very accurate, he said, with the precise self-criticism of a perfectionist in early development. The trees aren't right, but Papa said accuracy isn't always the point. Your Papa's correct, she said. He seemed pleased by this confirmation. He's in his study, he said. He said to tell you he'll be out in a few minutes. He was on a call. A pause. He's always on a call. There was no resentment in the observation, just a clear-eyed reporting of a child who has accepted the texture of his life without yet deciding how to feel about all of it. You said you made something, Nora said. His face changed, and the careful watchfulness replaced briefly by something younger and more unguarded. Hot chocolate, he said, with the real kind, not the powder. Mrs. Ferris showed me. He turned and led her toward the kitchen with the particular purposefulness of a child presenting something he's proud of but is managing his pride about carefully, and Nora followed him and thought, here is a child who has learned that showing people things you love makes you vulnerable, and who is showing me anyway. The kitchen was large and warm and smelled of chocolate and something spiced. Cinnamon, she thought, and something else she couldn't name. Eli moved through it with the competent ease of someone who spent real time here. Not the performing competence of a child showing off, but the natural ease of genuine familiarity. He poured her a cup with great concentration, both hands on the ladle, and presented it to her at the kitchen island, with the solemnity of someone completing an important task. She tasted it. Eli, she said, this is extraordinary. He looked at her searchingly, checking for the gap between what was said and what was true. He found none. Mrs. Ferris uses cardamom, he said, with the seriousness of someone sharing proprietary information. That's what it is. The thing you can't quite place. She laughed. It was a real laugh. The kind that arrives without construction, without the social engineering of a laugh deployed for warmth or ease. The kind that means something caught you genuinely, caught you in a moment of honest delight, and your body responded before your self-consciousness could intervene. Eli looked at her when she laughed, and something in his face, the careful, watchful, composed face of a child who had been composed for too long, did something she would never forget. It softened. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the way of a thing that has been held tight for a long time and has found in an instant that it is no longer necessary to hold quite so tight. He smiled. Not the small, managed, polite smile she had seen on him across a restaurant. A real one. Wide and slightly crooked, and reaching all the way to the watchful eyes, transforming them completely, making him look precisely and exactly his age in a way he rarely did. She thought, there he is, she thought. There is the child inside all that composure, she thought. I would do anything to keep seeing that. Damien appeared in the kitchen doorway. 20 minutes later, she and Eli were at the kitchen island, both with cups of hot chocolate, deep in a conversation about the story. About the woman in the forest, which Eli had opinions about that were precise and unexpected, and delivered with the absolute conviction of a person who has thought seriously about something and arrived at conclusions he trusts. The forest doesn't rescue her, Eli was saying, with the tone of someone correcting a common misreading. That's what people get wrong. She was never in danger. The forest just becomes because she's there, because she's been there long enough. And that's enough, Nora said, for the forest. Just her being there. Yes, Eli said. That's the whole point. She was about to respond when she felt the atmospheric change. The particular pressure shift that preceded Damien the way weather preceded the weather. And she looked up. He was standing in the doorway, his sleeves rolled back, no jacket, a coffee cup in one hand. The formal construction of him that she had seen in the restaurant. The charcoal suit, the overcoat, the complete and deliberate presentation of a man who moves through public spaces with no exposed edges, was absent. He was simply standing in his kitchen doorway in a gray shirt with his sleeves rolled back and his dark hair slightly less disciplined than usual. And the difference it made was profound in a way she hadn't anticipated. He looked not smaller, he looked actual. The size he was when the weight of being Damien Voss in the world was not something he was actively carrying. He looked at her. You found it all right, he said. Kaio is a very reliable navigator, she said. Something moved in his face. He'll be pleased to hear it. Papa, Eli said, with the comfortable authority of a child in his own home, Nora understands the story correctly. Damien looked at his son. Does she? She thinks the forest growing is the point, not the growing towards something, just the growing. That's not exactly what Nora started. It's what you meant, Eli said, with serene certainty. Damien set his cup down on the counter. He looked at Eli with the expression she had seen in the restaurant, the one that lived in an entirely different register from everything else about him, the one that was purely and defenselessly love, shaped by grief into something more complex than love alone, but no less total for it. She's right, Damien said, as usual. I'm always right, Eli said. Approximately, Damien said. Move up. Let her sit properly. Eli moved along the island with the ease of someone rearranging himself for a new configuration of the room, a configuration that included Nora at the island as a natural and expected element rather than a guest to be accommodated. Damien sat on the other side of her. The three of them sat at the kitchen island with their drinks in the gray December light coming through the kitchen windows, and the conversation continued, and it was ordinary. Not in the diminished sense of ordinary, not ordinary meaning small or insufficient, but ordinary in the truest and most valuable sense. Natural, unperformed, requiring nothing from any of them but presence. Eli asked her about the restaurant. She told him about Simone, about the lunch, crowd versus the dinner crowd, about the way the kitchen smelled different on different nights, depending on what was being prepared. And he listened with the complete attention of a child who finds the details of other lives genuinely interesting, rather than waiting for his turn to speak. She asked him about school. He told her about a teacher he found disappointing and a subject, to astronomy, that he found, in his word, necessary. And she asked what he meant by necessary, and he thought about it with genuine care and said, like something you didn't know, you were missing until you found it, and now you can't not know it. She thought about cardamom. She thought about the woman and the forest. She thought, necessary is exactly the right word. Damien said little during this. He sat with his coffee, and he was present in the way he was always present, fully, quietly, completely. And occasionally he said something brief that redirected or deepened the conversation, and the three of them moved through the morning in the specific and gentle rhythm of people who are still learning the music of each other, but have already found the key. After Eli had been called upstairs by Mrs. Forrest, a comfortable and efficient woman of 60 who moved through the house with the authority of someone who had been trusted with something important and took the trust seriously, and had gone with only a moderate amount of reluctance and the promise that Nora would stay for lunch, Nora and Damien were left alone in the kitchen. The shift in the room was immediate, not uncomfortable, not charged with anything negative, but more weighted, the way rooms become when the light particular to a child's presence is temporarily removed from them. Damien refilled his coffee. He held the pot toward her. She nodded, and he refilled hers. They sat. He's extraordinary, she said. I know I've said it before. You can say it again, he said. It doesn't get less true. She smiled. How is he really, outside the performance? He looked at her. You noticed the performance. He's 9, and he's been practicing composure since before he needed to, she said. Yes, I noticed. Damien was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands in a small, unguarded gesture, the kind of thing hands do when a mind is working through something honestly. Better, he said. He's better. The first year after Mara... He stopped. Breathe. He went very quiet, not sad, exactly. Quiet in a way that was worse than sad. Like he'd decided to take up less space, as if another stop. As if the space she'd occupied was too large to approach, Nora said softly. He looked at her, the dark and steady eyes with something in them that was not the usual assessment, not the gathering of information. Something more open than that, more costly. Yes, he said, exactly that. My mother, Nora said. She hadn't planned to say it, but the kitchen had a quality to it this morning. The warmth, the books, the drawing in the hallway, the cardamom smell still present in the air, that made honesty feel less like exposure and more like the natural behavior of the space. After she was diagnosed, she went quiet in a similar way, like she was already practicing being gone, so it would be less of a shock when she managed it. Damien looked at her. It was, Nora said, still a shock, regardless. Yes, he said, it is. They sat with that for a moment, two people in a kitchen, in the gray December light, holding the shapes of their respective losses, with the careful respect of people who have learned not to set them down carelessly. He started talking again, Damien said eventually, about 3 months ago, really talking, about things that mattered to him. The books came back first. He'd stopped reading for almost 8 months, which was. He looked at the counter. Mara read to him every night. When the books came back, I thought. He stopped. You thought she'd sent them back, Nora said. He was quiet. Maybe she did, Nora said. He looked at her. The expression on his face in that moment was one she knew she would carry with her, not because it was grand or dramatic or cinematic, but because it was none of those things. It was simply a man, a very guarded and very capable and very lonely man, being seen. Being seen in the specific way that she had always been good at, the way Eli had noticed across a restaurant, the way that had led to a book with 3 words in careful handwriting. He talked about you, Damien said. Before I brought the book, he talked about you for 3 days. About a waitress he'd seen for 20 minutes, she said. About a person, he said, who had looked at something he loved and wanted it, who had stood up without being asked, who had smiled at him like. He paused, choosing the words with the precision he always brought to language. Like he was worth smiling at without there being something required in return. The words arrived somewhere inside her that had been very quiet for a very long time. She thought about what it meant that a child had perceived all of that in 20 minutes, across a restaurant, in the middle of an ordinary shift, on an ordinary night. She thought about what it said about what he had been missing. He is, she said, worth it, without anything required. I know, Damien said, and so are you, she said. She hadn't planned that either. The kitchen held the sentence. Damien looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who has been offered something he hasn't decided yet whether he knows how to accept. Not refusing it, not deflecting it, sitting with it, turning it over in the interior, the way he had turned the coffee cup, with the honest and effortful attention of someone for whom this particular kind of thing was new terrain, and he was moving through it carefully, because careful was the only way he knew to move through things. He didn't want to break. Nora, he said. Yes, she said. I don't know how to do this, he said, whatever this is. He looked at the counter. I know how to do most things. I've built systems for most things. I've built distance, structure, process for 3 years, because those were the things I knew how to build, and building kept me functional, and functional was what Eli needed. She listened. I don't have a system for this, he said. He looked at her. For someone like you, for whatever it is you do that makes the room different when you're in it. I don't have a process for the fact that my son has been a different child in the 3 weeks since a waitress stepped between him and a drunk man and smiled at him across a restaurant. I'm still a waitress, she said. I know what you are, he said. And the way he said it had nothing diminishing in it. It was simply true, simply a statement of knowing, complete and without caveat. She looked at him. What are you asking me, Damien? He was quiet for a moment, the quiet of someone locating something they haven't said before in the geography of themselves, finding it, deciding to say it. I'm asking, he said, whether you would be willing to stay, not. He stopped. Not in any way that asks you to be something you're not. Not in any way that puts you in a position you don't choose. But to stay. In whatever form that takes to be here. She thought about everything that here contained, the risk of it, the weight of it, the specific complexity of a world she hadn't been born into and had not sought, with its invisible rules and its permanent consequences and its perimeter of people like Ko, who stood at the edges of other people's safety. She thought about a gray-shirted man with his sleeves rolled back, turning a coffee cup in his hands because he was saying something honest for the first time in a long time. She thought about Eli's crooked, real, completely unguarded smile. She thought about the forest, about the woman who had not rescued and had not been rescued, but who had simply been present long enough for the living world to grow toward her. About how the growing was not invasion, not takeover, not the replacement of one thing with another, just growth toward the light that was found. Yes, she said, one word, complete, unhurried, total. He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back at him, and the December light fell through the kitchen windows, and the house breathed around them with the particular warmth of a place that had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for exactly this wait to settle into it. Then from somewhere upstairs, Eli's voice, clear and unself-conscious and carrying down through the floors with the amplitude of a child who has not yet learned to modulate his enthusiasm. Is she staying for lunch? Damien closed his eyes briefly in the way of a man exercising patience. Nora laughed, the real laugh again, the uncontrolled one, the one that arrived before the self-consciousness could intervene. Yes, Damien said in the direction of the ceiling. Thundering footsteps. The distinct percussion of a 9-year-old descending stairs at a pace that suggested the stairs were optional. Eli appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath. The green sweater rumpled now in a way that made him look entirely and wonderfully 9 years old. He looked at Nora, then at his father, then back at Nora. Good, he said, with the complete satisfaction of someone whose calculations have come out correctly, because I want to tell you about the Orion constellation, and it takes a while. I have time, Nora said. You should know, he said very seriously, climbing back onto the stool beside her, that most people find it very interesting once they understand it. Papa pretends to find it interesting, but I can tell the difference. I do find it interesting, Damien said. You fall asleep, Eli said. I close my eyes to concentrate. You snore, Eli said. Nora laughed again. The real laugh. The uncontrolled, unhurried, completely genuine laugh of a woman who has arrived somewhere she did not plan for and has found, against all reasonable expectation, that it fits the shape of what she's been. Damien looked at her across the kitchen island. His expression was, she would think about this later on the bus, in the days that followed, in the incremental and careful way that the subsequent weeks unfolded, not happiness exactly, not the performed happiness of a man deciding to be happy. Something quieter and more durable than that. Something that looked in its deep and guarded and finally slightly open way, like the beginning of a life that had been interrupted, finding its way back to its own pulse. She held his gaze. She thought, this is what it looks like. Not the arrival, not the moment. The morning after the moment in the kitchen, with the gray light and the cardamom smell and the child explaining Orion with the gravity of a professor and the joy of someone who has decided you are worth knowing. She thought, this is what it was always going to look like. She thought, I am not afraid. She went back to Callaway's on Monday, her section, her tables, the amber light and the careful conversations and the long evenings and the weight of the trays and the 10-second calculations and the precise and particular skill of being present for other people's important moments without making those moments about herself. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. But something in the way she moved through the floor was different now, in a way so subtle she doubted anyone who hadn't been watching her very carefully would notice it. The efficiency was the same. The competence was the same. The quiet, unobtrusive grace that Petra had once called by the name she had had to look up. But the weight of her was different, not lighter exactly. She had not been relieved, oh, anything not truly. The world did not work that way, and she was too honest to pretend it did. The debt was gone, but debts were replaced by other debts in other forms. And she understood that what she had entered with Damien Voss was its own kind of serious, its own kind of weight, its own kind of thing that required maintenance and honesty and the ongoing willingness to be seen. The weight of her was different because she was no longer carrying it alone. Not because someone had taken it, because someone knew about it, because she had sat in a kitchen on a gray December morning and said yes to something she hadn't been looking for and had found that the yes had room in it that she hadn't known a yes could have. Simone found her at the service station between tables. She looked at Nora's face with the attentive affection of someone who has known you long enough to read the changes. Something happened, she said. Several things, Nora said. Good things? Nora considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. She thought about Victor Crane's car leaving the block. She thought about Eli's drawing in the hallway. She thought about cardamom. She thought about a man who had said, I don't have a system for this, with the specific and effortful honesty of someone for whom that admission cost something real. Yes, she said. Good things. Simone looked at her for another moment. Then she nodded, with the satisfied expression of someone whose private predictions have been confirmed. About time, she said. And she went back to her tables. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening, Damien came to Calloway's. Table 7, the Brenzino, the still water. But this time, when Nora brought the water and asked if he'd like to start with anything else, he looked up at her and said, with the precise and unperformed directness that was simply how he was, Eli wants to know if you'll come for Christmas. She looked at him. Just Eli, she said. The movement in his face, that rare, brief, almost smile, arriving and withdrawing in the same breath. No, he said, not just Eli. She held his gaze for a moment. I'll come, she said. He nodded. Good. She turned to go. Nora. She turned back. He was looking at her with those dark and steady eyes, and in them was the expression she had been learning to read across weeks of a careful and incremental proximity, the expression that lived beneath all the control, beneath all the structure, and the distance, and the built architecture of a man who had survived enormous loss by becoming very good at containing himself. The expression that looked in its deep and unguarded and finally open way like gratitude, not for what she'd done, for what she was. She understood. She smiled at him, the small, unhurried smile, the one that had crossed a restaurant on a November night and landed on a boy who was carrying more than children should carry, and that had started all of this with the simple and irreversible act of being seen, and seen truly. She turned back to her table. She carried a tray to table 4. She told the woman at table 11 about the soup. She refilled the water at table 3. She moved through the amber light of a room full of people living their important evenings, and she felt in the quiet and specific place in her chest that had been very still for a very long time, the thing that had been growing there without permission, without planning, without any system for its arrival, growing the way the forest grows, toward the light it finds, toward the warmth of a kitchen on a gray December morning, toward a child's unguarded smile and a man's careful honesty and the particular and precious ordinariness of a Saturday that had simply been allowed to be what it was. She was not afraid. She had never been afraid. And that singular and quite an extraordinary fact was the thing that had changed everything. Not power, not money, not protection, in the way protection is usually understood. Just a woman who looked at things, who stood up when it mattered, who said yes when she meant it and no when she meant it and held both words with the same steady and uncompromising hand, who had walked into the gravity of something enormous and said, I will not be moved for myself, and hadn't been and wouldn't be. That was Nora Callahan. That was who she had always been. The world had simply finally found a place large enough to hold her. If this story found you somewhere quiet, if it sat with you the way good things sit, without demanding anything in return, then you already know what it was about. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about the mafia or the money or the danger at the edges of the frame. It was about a woman who looked, and everything that grows towards someone who does. Stay with us. There are more stories where this one came from. Stories about quiet people in loud worlds, about the small moments that turn out to be the large ones, about what happens when ordinary people refuse, simply stubbornly, completely refuse to stop being themselves. We'll be here.